Communist Manifesto, originally the Manifesto of the Communist Party, is a book of communist political theory written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and originally published in 1848. It is many different things at once: a call to revolution, an analysis of history through the lens of Marx's brand of materialism and his and Engels' perspective on economics, and a critique of capitalism. It has renown as one of the most influential political documents in the world. Begins with a facetious declaration that a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, and ends with a grand international call to arms: working men of all countries unite, a powerful way to open and close one of the most definitive works of leftist literature in history. Merely for convenience's sake, I'll be citing all passages from the book as if Karl Marx was the sole writer. One of the statements that Marx opens the book with is that all of existing history so far is the history of class struggles. The Communist Manifesto is a book full of these types of broad and assured claims. This one in particular really elucidates how Marx conceptualized the world. It's less of a claim to be contested and more of an enunciation of his perspective. That is to say that one could seek to disprove it, but that would be missing the point. He goes on to describe different ways in which this concept of class struggle has manifested itself throughout history, such as patricians and plebeians in ancient Rome, and states that these struggles have always ended either in utter revolution or in the ruin of both classes. This conception of history by Marx is a clear derivative of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, or perhaps a materialist evolution or application of it. Marx goes on to say that our era is distinct from the others in the sense that the class divisions are more and more simplified into two different groups, these groups being the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. He describes how the bourgeoisie has built itself up over a series of revolutions in history, a concept that makes it seem as if this historical process is infinite and unchangeable, making me wonder how Marx sought to solve the problem and even things out. The answer is, of course, communism, a society without classes. But we've seen in history how a self-proclaimed communist front can sweep up a nation in revolution only to become in its new society the very upper class that it once was oppressed by. I suppose the thing that makes the bourgeoisie distinctive is that, as Marx describes, it has consumed all different forces of domination such as religion and political power through money, by money, and for money as the prevalent force of domination in society. But after a revolution where this bourgeoisie class is expunged, raw political power could easily take the place of money as the prevalent and all-consuming force of domination. Is Marx's materialism blind to this? And is this blindness what inadvertently and metaphysically caused the authoritarian communist catastrophes of the 20th century? Obviously, this is a complicated question predicated upon more complicated questions, but as an anarcho-communist who sees Stalinism as an abomination of Marxism, I think it's worth scanning for the causes of its flaws when looking at a piece of its source material. However, Marx says later in the book that political power is merely the organized power of one class oppressing another, and if the proletariat succeeded in its revolution and became the ruling class to abolish the bourgeois order and the old conditions that it existed in, then it would have abolished the conditions necessary for a class conflict and class itself. I'm skeptical about whether this would actually be the way that events would unfold. Do the communist conditions actually represent the conditions necessary for a classless society? At what point after transportation, communication, and credit is centralized by the state does the state dissolve? What's to stop whichever actual human beings embody the state at the time from being the new oppressive class? Marx points out another distinction between our current era and the eras of history before us. This distinction is that, unlike the serf and bourgeois who are able to raise themselves up from their conditions within their role as slaves, the modern worker only sinks lower while industry progresses. Marx says that this makes the bourgeoisie unfit to rule, since it can't help but make the proletariat sink into its lower state and must feed him instead of being fed by him. There is an interesting shift of tone here, where it seems as if Marx goes from talking about the class struggle as if it is an intrinsically negative thing, to talking about it with an air of necessity, as if he knows this structure must exist and further thinks that there is an ideal condition that it ought to exist in, and that the current way it manifests itself is not in this ideal condition. Maybe that's just my perception, and this is just some of his facetious sardonicism, which is a stylistic mechanism that I quite enjoy. He goes on to say that for this reason, the bourgeoisie is incompatible with society and that its downfall at the hands of the proletariat that it creates and feeds and arms is inevitable. It's worth noting that this hasn't happened yet. The bourgeois revolution and the proletarian revolution after it that Marx predicted would happen in Germany at the end of the book did not occur. But it shouldn't be depressing that the revolution hasn't happened yet. Just because our current historical position could make it seem as though the revolution is hopeless since it hasn't happened yet, doesn't mean it'll never happen at all. Marx explains how the bourgeois cries for freedom in the face of communism are not cries for the freedom of the people, but cries for the freedom of capital, since only capital has individuality in bourgeois society while people do not. The bourgeoisie only wants to protect their free selling and buying, horrified at the prospect that private property should be abolished, making it so that they are the only ones who even have private property. Even though they only possess private property by converting the individual property of others, making it so they are the only ones who even have private property at all. Capital exerts itself as a social force to protect itself, to protect the bourgeois property. But communism means freedom of the people instead of freedom of capital, and the dissipation of buying and selling altogether. It doesn't mean that no one can appropriate society's products, it just means that they can't use this to exploit others. Marx takes on the common objection to communism that under communism everyone would be lazy in a different, swifter way than Kropotkin does in The Conquest of Bread. He says that if this were true, bourgeois society would have fallen apart already since its members who work acquire nothing, while its members who acquire nothing don't work, or who acquire anything don't work. He also says that this objection is really just a tautology that there can be no wage labor when there is no capital. I think Kropotkin did a better job of answering the critique since he offered an alternative to the wage system, voluntary work, as part of his answer, and this responds more directly to the critique because it shows that Kropotkin understands that it is just the tautology described before. Marx later says that all the arguments against communism, be them religious, philosophical, or ideological, aren't worth addressing, which I disagree with because I don't think you can just answer a counter-argument with silence and expect to be viewed as correct. One of the most interesting parts in the Communist Manifesto is when Marx describes how the conditions around people shape their notions of the way things are. Specifically, he describes how the conditions of bourgeois production and property shape the bourgeoisie's understanding of concepts like freedom and law. This seems obvious yet infinitely interesting to me. Of course, people's conditions influence the way they see the world. Communists seek to revolutionize the conditions of the world, abolishing bourgeois conditions and therefore abolishing bourgeois culture. This is the deep-seated reason why such hysteria erupts whenever the true left rears its head in the bourgeois monolith that is America. The bourgeoisie will do anything to protect its position of power because its position of power is inextricably connected with the bourgeois conditions that allow it, and this is why they will do anything to preserve these conditions. Marx had some interesting thoughts about women. He said that women are viewed by bourgeois culture as an instrument of production and sought to abolish this view along with the abolition of bourgeois culture. It's clear that he is speaking of the old traditionalist view of women as a resource, something that needs protection, something with a function to be exploited, something instead of someone. This same abhorrent view is retained and openly expressed by the neo-fascists of today. Marx also made the bourgeoisie out to be ferocious womenizers who not only took the wives and daughters of the proletarians as well as prostitutes, but seduced each other's wives as well, making bourgeois marriage nothing more than wives held in common in a hypocritical and secretive way. He also said that naturally, with the abolition of the bourgeois system, prostitution would be abolished as well, which makes sense because without buying and selling, there would be no buying and selling of prostitutes. In conclusion, the Communist Manifesto is a foundational work of leftist literature that offers a deep analysis of history through the lens of Karl Marx's dialectical materialism. It is also a powerful call to arms for the left, bolstered by strong metaphors and bombastic, self-assured intellectual language. I think this is what is best suited to serve as in the modern age, rather than a note of praxis that should be followed to the letter. That was my Communist Manifesto analysis. Stay tuned for the Idea of Communism by Slavoj Žižek one, and I will see you guys later.